Franz Mesmer, Dianetics and Exploitation. In the latter half the 18th century, Vienna, a Franz Mesmer was stirring a commotion within upper society circles with what he proclaimed to be a universal therapeutic healing technique that involved magnets, ambient lighting, and electrical currents. Mesmer suggested that within the human was an ethereal fluid, which ran through us in perpetuity, and our ailments were otherwise the result of this fluid being blocked or hindered in some way, and that his treatment was the means in which to unblock this flow of invisible energy. Now, Mesmer's methods yielded inconclusive results at best, drawing the attention of both skeptic and even the loyalty of patients alike. The method he claimed he had discovered came briefly to be known as animal magnetism. And the method went as such: upon arrival to a dimly lit, well-toned room, a circular table. On that table, a set of rods, attached to a magnet, his guests would arrive to a scene of ambience, you could say, and his guests would sit at this round table, and in front of them this rod. The procedure went in that the guests would receive a very subtle but memorable jolt originating from a magnetic origin, and that in unison they would experience it, and then, as it were, had symptoms of psychological and benign physical ailment at the least, be alleviated. It was said his patients would exhibit behavior ranging from convulsions to feeling dizzy or energized. However, upon what was the closer observation of the validity of this technique by the medical community, the existence of this invisible fluid as being a source of ailments and the actual technique itself being a miracle cure of all ailment, turned out to be baseless. Though it could be for a moment seen that the electrotherapy could perhaps on a surface level provide an obscure relief from something, it was no miracle cure, as it did not cure anything. Blindness at once was claimed to be an accessible ailment to this method, though immediately after a stimulation, one's only tinkered photo-optic activity returned to its darkened state. Those claiming to have been alleviated of other ailments might have described the same inconsistency after the fact. The term mesmerized originates in namesake from the man himself, by definition to hypnotize. Mesmer's animal magnetism method was some of the earliest demonstrations of the placebo effect, where something works on the basis that you expect it to, thus your mind creates the illusion. Now, if I may for a moment divert from what seems the next point from here, so as to illustrate a point of relatability and context to the issue I touch on. If you or someone you know has ever found themselves involved in a relationship that could be described as toxic, that is, it's always a turbulence before it was an uplifting, through and through. Perhaps even escalating into physical violence and emotional abuse. Yet, despite that, this individual always seems to find themselves in the same situation, having not gone into nor come out of that situation having gained any kind of self-respect enough to know that they were worthy of more. This individual may not have been permitted enough of themselves to love themselves enough to consider that emotional abuse has an erasure, blackmail as leverage, especially to one who does not recognize it enough to tell the difference between their own self-flagellation confused for love, so they endure it as deserved. This individual is afraid to be alone, therefore jumps from relationship to relationship, having not learned the lesson from the previous. And if this abuse is constant enough, it can be so depersonalizing and mirroring to one's psyche, that someone could stub their toe on a table and still find a way to make you feel guilty for it, thus they are wrapped around a finger. The interaction that facilitates this depressive state is called gaslighting, and what gaslighting is, the act of invoking an emotional ambiguity, an interruption of one's thought process as it is happening, where one is not permitted perspective on their reality. This happens ever so subtly. It can come just after a genuine inquiry into an issue, but the issue is quickly mirrored back to you before you get a countable reply. With repetition, the erasure of this can assume the place of your reality and thought process altogether. An outer voice becomes an inner voice. Now, with that in mind, going back to Mesmer's apparatus, where conductivity in electrochemical reactions produces a reaction. Around 2 centuries later, the invention of the galvanometer, or psychogalvanometer, which is the instrument used to measure the electrochemical activity within one person to gain a sense of one's mental and emotional states. In other words, the fundamental principle for the polygraph test and a measurement of someone either telling a truth or a lie. The polygraph test is for the most part an effective means of investigative work. However, there lies a moment of paradox where what you are essentially measuring is activity either interpreted as disturbance and therefore some sort of discrepancy within the sessions where the investigator makes a correlation between truth and a lie. Now, as per any experiment, we remember to consider factors of uncertainty. Cognitive, environmental. Any reason at this point understandably is a cause for some anxiety, innocent test subject or otherwise. And when it came to the cognitive, the nature of those processes were not always so cut and dry as the cause implying the verdict on paper. Electrochemical activity as a phenomena, as per the experience of them, is not so coherent that one always even makes the distinction between a thought and an unrelated emotion, but the polygraph doesn't know that either. In fact, what mind is able to at one moment differentiate in thought and emotion. Given an unversed mind, made thought prone to having itself confused for something that it wasn't. Inner confrontation combined with a memory distinct from the situation at hand may very well provide that illusion of affairs that sabotaged the authenticity of the nature of the experience. This was partly descriptive of thought itself, and by no means unobservable by the thinker, at least where it was at the forefront of conscious thought, but therein lies the moment of truth, or untruth, where the ambiguity of that experience is what could at least be empirical to the experiencer, made thought and self prone to having its own nature suggested to it. For example, in the case of postpartum depression and PTSD, a course of thought may be so self-cycling and depressive, where one is contemplating almost with an obsessive compulsion, say, with mental health in mind, the thought of harming one's own child, though being very confused at the nature of those thoughts. Mind is compelled to question its own nature and even fear it, questioning one's own goodness. The very mentioning of the issue may even be enough to cause unease obviously, but this is a turbulence of sentience and the elusive sobriety here gets lost in its own wake. The thought itself does not possess the truth of its origin and intention, but the very fact you suffer it at all reveals just beneath the underbrush yourself apart from the dwelling, and find confidence in that anyways. The predation of or honesty to here lied in the difference between either invoking and then telling you what it was, as opposed to showing you what it was and enabling an agency, and in that, hope that one has the beginnings of a trust. Now, though the subject of energy being presentable in its measurable and observable forms, and also not to merely disregard the sensing of oneself in patience and study, the problem with simply saying the word energy is that it is only as indicative as whatever happens to be on the immediate awareness, and doesn't really describe so much what it's otherwise surrounding in just out-of-sight relations with mind and memory accounts for apart from that.